This training video is an introduction to visual supports. The video is brought to you by the Delaware Network for Excellence in Autism. Please use the following citation when referencing this training. By the completion of this training video, participants will be able to identify 4 different types of visual supports that can be used to support learners with autism spectrum disorder. Define when and how each visual support should be used to support a learner. Plan, implement, and monitor the use of visual supports across settings. Here is the overview of today's training session. We will start by reviewing the core characteristics of autism. Next, we will review 4 types of visual supports: visual schedules, visual timers, visual boundaries, and visual cues. Then, we will discuss how to plan, implement, and monitor visual supports while wrapping up with some additional resources. There are 2 core areas of development that differ in individuals with autism. Autism is characterized by differences with social communication and interaction, and a demonstration of restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. Individuals with autism exhibit these characteristics in a variety of ways and to varying degrees. It's important to consider how these differences impact how an individual functions across all settings, particularly as we talk about using visual supports. Before we begin our discussion and review of visual supports, it's important to note that you need to use the evidence-based practices of prompting and reinforcement to plan, teach, and monitor the implementation of each type of visual support. If you are unfamiliar with prompting and reinforcement, we encourage you to view our Designing and Using Reinforcement and Introduction to Evidence-Based Practices for Individuals with Autism training videos in order to support your learning. You may hear a lot about evidence-based practices, but not everyone knows what makes a practice evidence-based. A practice is identified as evidence-based if it has multiple studies to support its use. These studies must be high quality. That is, they must use valid and sound research methods, and they must be published in a peer-reviewed journal. That is, other experts in the field have examined the studies and deemed them to be high quality. It can be pretty difficult to determine if a practice is evidence-based, so a number of clearinghouses exist in the field of autism and education that are tasked with looking at all of the research published on a particular practice in order to determine if it meets the threshold for being evidence-based. Some of the clearinghouses noted here also have excellent resources for educators and professionals to learn more about these practices. Here in the state of Delaware, the DNEA was established to disseminate high-quality information about evidence-based practices and supports for people with autism across the lifespan. Visual supports are an evidence-based practice as determined by national reviews of the literature in autism practices. They can support most areas of functioning. They can support specifically classroom behaviors such as staying on task and engaged, or knowing when to raise your hand. Visual supports can also be used for communication, such as requesting items. Socially, visual supports can be used for having a conversation, greeting a friend in play. In addition, visual supports can support any type of functional skills, such as washing hands, toileting, or learning different types of coping skills. Let's start by defining visual supports. Do you have a calendar that you use to write things in to keep you organized? Do you make a shopping list before you go to the store? Do you read signs that tell you where to stand in line or which door to exit? Do you follow a recipe to make and bake a cake? Do you make a checklist of what you need to do each day? Or do you ever leave a note on the bathroom mirror to remind you to do something? These are all examples of visual supports. Visual supports are concrete cues that are paired with or used in place of a verbal cue to provide the learner with information about a routine, activity, behavioral expectation, or skill demonstration. Visual supports might include pictures, written words, objects, arrangement of the environment, visual boundaries, visual schedules, maps, labels, organization systems, timelines, and scripts. They are powerful because they help individuals understand the physical environment, understand expectations, and create consistency across environments. So why are visual supports important for individuals with autism spectrum disorder? Visual supports can support social interactions, provide understanding of expectations and changes in routines. They can help increase comprehension of verbal information. Visual supports also help to foster independence. They're very concrete and remain as permanent representations. They also offer sameness across contexts and environments. Let's continue to review why visual supports are very helpful. They help to clarify expectations by making abstract concepts such as time, the order of events, or expectations more concrete. They help to establish predictability, which may decrease anxiety that someone may be feeling when they don't know what is coming next or when an activity may end. They help to promote skill acquisition. Skills that can be supported include self-help skills such as washing their hands or getting dressed. It could also include academic skills such as addition or writing a letter. It could also include social skills such as initiating a greeting. Visual supports also help to promote independence. Unlike a verbal direction or verbal prompt, these visual supports remain constant in the environment and can be referred to at any time. Now that we've introduced visual supports, let's talk about how to implement them. We will be reviewing each step of creating and using visual supports. First, we must determine a learner's visual stage, whether it is object, picture symbolic, line drawing, or text. Next, we must identify the types of supports that the learner may benefit from accessing, whether it be using visual schedules, visual timers, visual boundaries, or visual cues. The final step that we will be discussing is planning, implementing, and monitoring progress. You will see the symbol on the left-hand corner of the slides to indicate what step we are reviewing. First, you need to determine a learner's visual stage. Generally, there are 5 stages of visual supports that can be provided. The first state is object, where you use actual objects and items. For example, you would use a real apple. The next stage is photo. In this stage, you use real photos such as pictures or magazine photos. As you can see in this example, you would use a picture of a real apple. Next, you have picture symbolic, which is the use of colored drawings, as you can see on the slide. Line drawing is the next visual stage, using black and white line drawings. Lastly, with the text stage, you use written words or numbers for communication needs. Again, it is important that your visual supports incorporate materials aligned with your learner's visual stage. When you introduce text, you will want to make sure that your learner is able to read and comprehend it. You can start by pairing text with an image and then fading that image over time. In addition to visual stage, there are some other considerations that should be made when developing a visual support. You want to make sure that the language and reading abilities are appropriate. You want to think about the age of the person that you're creating this visual for, as well as their fine motor skills and other cognitive or behavioral needs. The next step is to identify the visual supports needed for your learner. We are going to discuss 4 different categories of visual supports today: visual schedules, visual timers, visual boundaries, and visual cues. Each visual support should be individualized for your learner and incorporate materials aligned with your learner's visual stage. At the same time, as mentioned, each visual support will have its own procedures for planning, implementing, and monitoring progress. Before we continue, we want to note that all individuals can benefit from the use of visual supports, but especially those individuals with autism. Let's start our review with visual schedules. Visual schedules will help a learner who does not understand routines or changes in routines. They are helpful for learners who do not understand or remember steps in a routine, or learners who need help remembering their daily schedule. They can help to build independence and reduce anxiety about what is happening next. More specifically, visual schedules are used to identify activities or events that will occur in an identified time frame. You will see multiple examples of visual schedules on this slide. You can see one of the visual schedules uses real objects. Another visual schedule uses photos and pictures. Now let's look at a few different versions of schedules. Most of these could be used on the go, which is helpful, so we like to refer to these as portable schedules. Starting at the top left corner, you can see the left to right progression of what needs to be done and what is completed. This is a great way to present a schedule, as it provides the child with the opportunity to see what they have accomplished and what is left to complete. On the top right, you will see a red file folder that has pictures related to a morning routine. The bottom left shows a purple first then card. This is based on the principle that a child's motivation to complete a less preferred activity is increased when it is followed by a more preferred activity. For instance, you could first put on shoes, then go outside. The bottom right is a daily schedule that's on a ring. This allows for complete portability traveling with the child. Here are some additional examples for learners who are strong readers. In the top left, you see a written schedule that is color coordinated by class. With the classes being paired to a specific color, it can help the student with organization and remembering their schedule. One can also present a schedule with just words. As you can see, the tasks or activities can be crossed or checked off once complete. This can be very motivating and reinforcing. Now, let's talk about how to plan for visual schedules. Remember, when you are developing a schedule, you should consider your learner very carefully. For example, 20-step schedules are overwhelming for a child who may get anxious about their day. First, the schedule materials need to be organized. It is important that you have the picture cards or materials ready for what will be happening on a given day. If there are special events like field trips or an appointment, it is important to have those ready. Make sure your picture symbols are child-proof and child-friendly. It is always a good idea to laminate the symbols as they will last longer. It is also important to write the word underneath each symbol. Finally, attach sticky Velcro to the back of each symbol. If you cannot fit the individual's entire day on the schedule, or if the individual does better with less information at a time, it is fine to simply provide part of the day on the schedule. While they are engaged in one of the last activities on the schedule, you can arrange the schedule to include the next part of the day or have it ready on another board to provide once the first section is complete. You may also want to think about what the learner has the most difficulty with. As an example, if the child struggles with bedtime activities, you may want to have a visual schedule specifically for the bedtime routine. It is important to determine cues for initiating the schedule use. This speaks to how the individual will know when to use the schedule. For example, hearing the bell at school or a verbal or visual prompt to go and get their schedule. It is also very important to create a task analysis based on the steps of the schedule. Write down, in chronological order, the activities that are planned for the day across the environment. Like any new concept, using a schedule is something that you need to teach the child. It may not automatically have meaning to them. Use enough prompting to ensure the child uses the schedule, but fade prompts out slowly so the child goes to the schedule with increasing independence. Lastly, be sure to identify a reinforcement procedure for using the schedule. Keep the schedule near the child and at eye level, and praise them for following the schedule appropriately. After you finish planning, there are multiple steps to implement a visual schedule. First, arrange the schedule for your learner. Deliver the predetermined cue each time you want the learner to use their schedule. Implement prompting procedures to assist your learner in following the steps of the task analysis. Remember to prompt from behind. Reinforce your learner for accessing and following their schedule. Promote generalization by using the schedule across all parts of the day. Now, let's talk about visual timers. Visual timers help to transform an abstract concept like time into a more concrete form that can be seen. Visual timers can be used to create predictability around desirable and undesirable activities. You might also consider utilizing a visual timer if you feel like the individual needs support with understanding the duration of an activity, determining how long an undesirable activity will last, and preparing for the end of a preferred activity. Here are different types of visual timers that can be used across different age bands and settings. Timers can be low or high tech. You should consider what kind of timer the individual would benefit from. For example, if an individual understands the concept of time, a digital timer might be very useful for them. When planning for visual timers, you need to determine activities that the individual would benefit from when using a visual timer. You want to define the rules or procedures for using the timer. You also want to identify prompting and fading your prompting in order to help the individual follow the rules and associate it with the timer. Lastly, you want to identify your reinforcement procedures for adhering to the timer. In order to implement visual timers, it's important to set the visual timer where the learner can see it. Typically, an adult sets up the timer, but you may want to teach the learner to set their own timer for teaching self-management. This may need to be taught in smaller increments and then shaped for longer increments of time during enjoyable activities. You want to model and follow the predetermined rules or procedures for using the timer. This can include modeling or any kind of conversation about looking at the timer and stating how much time is left. You want to implement prompting procedures to assist the learner in following the timer, which could include verbal prompting or physical prompting or gesture prompting. You want to promote generalization across different activities in different parts of the individual's day. It is important to fade the cues and prompts for using the timer over time until the individual can follow the timer independently. Now, we're moving on to talk about visual boundaries. Visual boundaries help to clarify what happens in a particular space, what is contained in that space, what is located in that space, and what to attend to in that space. You may consider using visual boundaries if your learner needs support understanding expectations for different areas or locations of an environment, bringing awareness to their body's position in relation to others, understanding abstract rules about space and the environment more concretely, or maintaining a safe learning area. Visual boundaries can be as simple as putting tape on the floor to help keep activities in a defined space. Visual boundaries can also highlight natural boundaries that already occur in the environment. Your boundaries should focus on making the abstract more concrete for your learner. There are many boundaries that have been added to our environment that we adhere to every day, such as lines on roads. On this slide, you see some examples of visual boundaries. In the top left of the picture, you can see tape used to designate play areas. In the top right, circular mats could be used to designate seats for circle time. The bottom left shows furniture used to shape visual boundaries. In the bottom right, you see a blue blanket placed over an item as a boundary to access that item. When planning for visual boundaries, it's important to determine activities or settings that would benefit from the use of a visual boundary. It's important to remember to highlight natural boundaries and to create visual boundaries, for example, using colored tape, furniture, or other materials. Determine the rules for that space and its boundaries, for example, keeping the chair in the square or keeping hands and materials in the taped part of the desk. It is important to make sure these rules are clearly defined and taught to the individual. It is also important to identify your prompting procedures when teaching your learner these rules. In addition, when planning for visual boundaries, one must identify reinforcement procedures to adhering to the rules associated with the space and its boundaries. When implementing visual boundaries, one must introduce the learner to the location of the physical boundaries. It's important to model how to follow these rules associated with the space and its boundaries. Again, you want to identify and implement prompting procedures. In addition, reinforcing the learner to use the rules is very important. Again, be sure to fade your prompting over time so your learner adheres to the visual boundary independently. The last type of visual that we will review are visual cues. Visual cues provide information about an activity, event, or concept in a visual format in order to increase successful task completion. Visual cues can increase engagement in an activity as well as motivation and independence. You could consider utilizing visual cues if the individual that you are supporting needs help with initiating a response, understanding what is available to them, expressing their choice or preference, or engaging in activities independently. Visual cues can take many forms. Let's look at some examples. Examples of environmental visual labeling can include labels on bins, rugs, furniture, or space for an activity. Autistic students may struggle with receptive language skills, so environmental labeling can help the student understand your request and the environment that they are in. Labeling is one of the easiest ways to provide visual support in the environment. Individuals with autism find it less stressful and easier to participate efficiently and function independently in activities when labels are added to the environment. Here are some examples of environmental labeling. Choice making is a great way to increase an individual's engagement in activities. One can provide a set number of visuals to let the learner see what their options are in a specific activity. Choices can be indicated by pointing, moving an icon, handing an icon to a person, putting an icon on a designated spot, and so on. It is important to consider a person's fine motor skills when using a choice board as a visual cue. On this slide, you see different examples of choice boards. The choice boards can be used from choosing from a menu at a restaurant, to games, to drinks, to snacks, and including communication phrases. Activities can be broken down to individual steps and sequenced on a strip. These are particularly helpful when using a chaining procedure to teach a multi-step activity. For example, you can pair prompting or modeling with the visual of washing hands to show each step. In addition, it is important to keep in mind what's best for the individual who is using the visual cue. This can be determined by how many steps you want to show at once, how you are displaying them, such as if you decide to cover the cues that are later on to only show the individual what you're doing next. When planning to use visual cues, it is important to identify the activities, events, or concepts that are abstract or unclear. Creating a visual cue that accompanies the activity, event, or concept that aligns with the level of support needed for the individual is very important. In addition, one must identify prompting and reinforcement systems that help the individual access and use the cue. When implementing visual cues, you must first introduce the individual to the cue and model its use. Use the prompting procedures to teach the individual how to use and follow the visual cues. Reinforce the learner for accessing and using the visual cue, such as saying, "Great job using your choice board to tell me what you want." In addition, it is important to fade prompting over time so the individual can access and use the cue independently. Over time, this will help the individual to be able to select activities that they prefer to do and build on their independence. In addition, it is important to plan for generalization and use the cue across multiple settings, people, and activities. Now, let's talk about monitoring. What we will discuss applies to all of the 4 types of visual supports that we reviewed: visual cues, visual boundaries, visual schedules, and timers. The final stage of teaching and using visual supports is monitoring the efficacy of the visual support. With all of the visuals that we discussed, it is important to collect data. You will want to collect regular data and inspect those data to determine the efficacy of the support. It's important to collect data on the independence level for accessing and using the visual support. Some things you might want to consider are they using their schedule? Are they looking at the timer they're using? Are they following the environmental labels? Are they keeping their chair within the boundary? After teaching individuals to use visual supports, it's important to note if they are accessing or using them in different tasks, settings, and with different people. As far as your data collection method, you could consider using interval recording. This involves observing whether a behavior occurs or does not occur during a specified time period. In addition, you will want to analyze your data and determine how the supports are benefiting the individual. You want to make sure that you are supporting fading of your prompts for accessing and using the visual support. In addition, you want to modify the reinforcement over time. Visual supports are meant to be semi-permanent or permanent supports that are put in place to clarify expectations. Visual supports are meant to be used consistently across people and settings, which means it is important to collaborate with everyone on an individual's team. PECS, or Picture Exchange Communication System, is used to teach functional communication, and they remain a part of an individual's communication plan. Visual prompts are instructional and systematically used and faded within short periods of time and on an as-needed basis. Also, remember, visual supports must be systematically taught. An individual should not be expected to know how to use them without any teaching. In summary, autistic individuals struggle with verbal instructions and specific steps that lead to knowing what will happen next. Visuals provide expectations, help increase on-task behavior, and promote independence. Visual supports present information in a way that helps the individual focus on key elements that will help them succeed. If you're interested in learning more about visual supports, please see the resource guides and additional training videos on the DNEA website. Please contact the DNEA for additional information, trainings, and resources. Here are the references used to create this training video. Thank you.